Sorry about the delay. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggith, and today we have got some Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons for you. It's the start of part 2 of the book, and stuff's about to go down. We got a lot. That's going to go down in a fairly short amount of time. This is probably going to be a little shorter than some of the last few, but it is more than made up for by the sheer volume of what we're going to encounter. Alrighty. Previously on, what happened previously? Let's see. Um, oh, yes. The big thing that happened previously was that the hegemony forces in orbit around Hyperion or in Hyperion system uh, are not adequate to force the ouster threat away. So the military bigwigs of Force, F-O-R-C-E, whatever that stands for, I don't remember off the top of my head, um, they're basically saying we need to basically send something like 2/3 of the active combat vessels in the entire hegemony and just the entire web all over to Hyperion. Which is very much putting your eggs all in one basket. And one young guy is like, I think this is probably a bad idea because you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Um, but he's largely overruled. Or Gladstone takes it into consideration and is like, well, unfortunately, we got to go ahead with it because we've got too much to lose if Hyperion falls. So, it's a big mistake, maybe, or it could be the gambit that wins them the war. We won't know until a while later. Much to cover before then. Alrighty, so with that, I'll just get cracking. Y'all can sit back, relax, and put on your seatbelt. It's gonna be bumpy. Part 2, Chapter 16. Braun Lamia slept fitfully just before dawn, and her dreams were filled with images and sounds from elsewhere. Half-heard and little understood conversations with Mina Gladstone, a room that seemed to be floating in space, a movement of men and women along corridors where the walls whispered like a poorly tuned fat-line receiver. And underlying the feverish dreams and random images was the maddening sense that Johnny, her Johnny, was so close, so close. Lamia cried out in her sleep, but the noise was lost in the random echoes of the Sphinx's cooling stones and shifting sands. Lamia awoke suddenly, coming completely conscious as surely as a solid-state instrument switching on. Saul Weintraub had been supposed to be standing guard, but now he slept near the low door of the room where the group sheltered. His infant daughter, Rachel, slept between blankets on the floor next to him. Her rump was raised, face pressed against the blanket, a slight bubble of saliva on her lips. Lamia looked around. In the dim illumination from a low wattage glow globe and the faint daylight reflected down 4 meters of corridor, only one other of her fellow pilgrims was visible, a dark bundle on the stone floor. Martin Silenus lay there snoring. Lamia felt a surge of fear, as if she had been abandoned while sleeping. Silenus, Saul, the baby. She realized that only the consul was missing. Attrition had eaten at the pilgrimage party of 7 adults and an infant. Het Mastine, missing on the wind wagon, crossing the sea of grass. Lenar Hoyt, killed the night before. Cassad, missing later that night. The consul. Where was the consul? Braun Lamia looked around again, satisfied herself that the dark room held nothing but packs, blanket bundles, the sleeping poet, scholar, and child, and then she rose, found her father's automatic pistol amidst the tumble of blankets, felt in her pack for the neural stunner, and then slipped past Weintraub and the baby into the corridor beyond. It was morning, and so bright out that Lamia had to shield her eyes with her hand as she stepped from the Sphinx's stone steps onto the hard-packed trail which led away down the valley. The storm had passed. Hyperion's skies were a deep, crystalline lapis lazuli shot through with green. Hyperion's star, a brilliant white point source, just rising above the eastern cliff walls. Rock shadows blended with the outflung silhouettes of the time tombs across the valley floor. The jade tombs sparkled. Lamia could see the fresh drifts and dunes deposited by the storm, white and vermilion sands blending in sensuous curves and striations around stone. There was no evidence of their campsite the night before. The consul sat on a rock 10 meters down the hill. He was gazing down the valley, and smoke spiraled upward from his pipe. Slipping the pistol in her pocket with the stunner, Lamia walked down the hill to him. "No sign of Colonel Cassad," said the consul as she approached. He did not turn around. Lamia looked down the valley to where the crystal monolith stood. Its once gleaming surface was pocked and pitted. The upper 20 or 30 meters appeared to be missing, and debris still smoked at its base. The half-kilometer or so between the Sphinx and the monolith were scorched and cratered. "It looks as if he didn't leave without a fight," she said. The consul grunted. The pipe smoke made Lamia hungry. "I searched as far as the Shrike Palace, 2 clicks down the valley," said the consul. The locus of the firefight seems to have been the monolith. There's still no sign of a ground-level opening to the thing, but there are enough holes farther up now so that you can see the honeycomb pattern which deep radar has always shown inside." "But no sign of Cassad?" "None." "Blood? Scorched bones? A note saying that he'd be back after delivering his laundry?" "Nothing." Braun Lamia sighed and sat on a boulder near the consul's rock. The sun was warm on her skin. She squinted out toward the opening to the valley. "Well, hell," she said. "What do we do next?" The consul removed his pipe, frowned at it, and shook his head. "I tried the comlog relay again this morning, but the ship is still penned in." He shook ashes out. "Tried the emergency bands too, but obviously we're not getting through. Either the ship isn't relaying, or people have orders not to respond." "Would you really leave?" The consul shrugged. He had changed from his diplomatic finery of the day before into a rough wool pullover tunic top, gray whipcord trousers, and high boots. "Having the ship here would give us, you, the option of leaving. I wish the others would consider going. After all, Mastine's missing. Hoyt and Cassad are gone. I'm not sure what to do next." A deep voice said, "We could try making breakfast." Lamia turned to watch Saul come down the path. Rachel was in the infant carrier on the scholar's chest. Sunlight glinted on the older man's balding head. "Not a bad idea," she said. "Do we have enough provisions left?" "Enough for breakfast," said Weintraub. "There's a few more meals of cold food packs from the colonel's extra provisions bag. Then we'll be eating googlepedes and each other." The consul attempted a smile, set the pipe back in his tunic pocket. "I suggest we walk back to Kronos Keep before we reach that point. We'd used up the We'd used up the freeze-dried foods from the Benares, but there were storerooms at the keep. I'd be happy to, began Lamia, but was interrupted by a shout from inside the Sphinx. She was the first to reach the Sphinx, and she had the automatic pistol in her hand before she went through the entrance. The corridor was dark, the sleeping room darker, and it took a second for her to realize that no one was there. Braun Lamia crouched, swinging the pistol toward the dark curve of corridor, even as Silenus's voice again shouted, "Hey, come here!" from somewhere out of sight. She looked over her shoulder as the consul came through the entrance. "Wait there!" snapped Lamia, and moved quickly down the corridor, staying against the wall, pistol extended, propulsion charge primed, safety off. She paused at the open doorway to the small room where Hoyt's body lay, crouched, swung around and in with weapon tracking. Martin Silenus looked up from where he crouched by the corpse. The fiberplastic sheet they had used to cover the priest's body lay crumpled and lifted in Silenus's hand. He stared at Lamia, looked without interest at the gun, and gazed back at the body. "Do you believe this?" he said softly. Lamia lowered the weapon and came closer. Behind them, the consul peered in. Braun could hear Saul Weintraub in the corridor. The baby was crying. "My God," said Braun Lamia, and crouched next to the body of Father Lenore Hoyt. The young priest's pain-ravaged features had been resculpted into the face of a man in his late 60s. High brow, long aristocratic nose, thin lips with a pleasant upturn at the corners, sharp cheekbones, sharp ears under a fringe of gray hair, large eyes under lids as pale and thin as parchment. The consul crouched near them. "I've seen Hollows. It's Father Paul Duray." "Look," said Martin Silenus. He lowered the sheet further, paused, and then rolled the corpse on its side. Two small cruciforms on this man's chest pulsed pinkly, just as Hoyt's had, but his back was bare. Saul stood by the door, hushing Rachel's cries with gentle bouncing and whispered syllables. When the infant was silent, he said, "I thought that the Bikura took 3 days to regenerate." Martin Silenus sighed. "The Bikura have been resurrected by the cruciform parasites for more than 2 standard centuries. Perhaps it's easier the first time." "Is he—" began Lamia. "Alive?" Silenus took her hand. "Feel." The man's chest rose and fell ever so slightly. The skin was warm to the touch. Heat from the cruciforms under the skin was palpable. Braun Lamia snatched her hand back. The thing that had been the corpse of Father Lenar Hoyt 6 hours earlier opened its eyes. "Father Duray," said Saul, stepping forward. The man's head turned. He blinked as though the dim light hurt his eyes, then made an unintelligible noise. "Water," said the consul, and reached into his tunic pocket for the small plastic bottle he carried. Martin Silenus held the man's head while the consul helped him drink. Saul came closer, went to one knee, and touched the man's forearm. Even Rachel's dark eyes seemed curious. Saul said, "If you can't speak, blink twice for yes, once for no. Are you Duray?" The man's head swiveled toward the scholar. "Yes," he said softly, his voice deep, tones cultured. "I am Father Paul Duray." Breakfast consisted of the last of the coffee, bits of meat fried over the unfolding heating unit, a scoop of grain mix with rehydrated milk, and the end of their last loaf of bread, torn into 5 chunks. Lamia thought that it was delicious. They sat at the edge of shade under the Sphinx's outflung wing, using a low, flat-topped boulder as their table. The sun climbed toward mid-morning, and the sky remained cloudless. There was no sound except for the occasional clink of a fork or spoon and the soft tones of their conversation. "You remember before?" asked Saul. The priest wore an extra set of the consul's ship clothes, a gray jumpsuit with the hegemony seal on the left breast. The uniform was a bit too small. Duray held the cup of coffee in both hands, as if he were about to lift it for consecration. He looked up, and his eyes suggested depths of intelligence and sadness in equal measure. "Before I died," said Duray. The patrician lips sketched a smile. "Yes, I remember. I remember the exile, the Bikura." He looked down. "Even the Tesla tree." "Hoyt told us about the tree," said Braun Lamia. "Hoyt told us about the tree," said Braun Lamia. The priest had nailed himself onto an active Tesla tree in the flame forests, suffering years of agony, death, resurrection, and death again, rather than give in to the easy symbiosis of life under the cruciform. Duray shook his head. "I thought, in those last seconds, that I had beaten it." "You had," said the consul. "Father Hoyt and the others found you. You had driven the thing out of your body. Then the Bikura planted your cruciform on Lenar Hoyt." Duray nodded. "And there is no sign of the boy? Of the boy?" Martin Silenus pointed toward the man's chest. "Evidently the fucking thing can't defy laws governing conservation of mass. Hoyt's pain had been so great for so long, he wouldn't return to where the thing wanted him to go, that he never gained the weight for a, what the hell would you call it? A double resurrection." "It doesn't matter," said Duray. His smile was sad. "The DNA parasite in the cruciform has infinite patience. It will reconstitute one host for generations if need be. Sooner or later, both parasites will have a home." "Do you remember anything after the Tesla tree?" asked Saul quietly. Duray sipped the last of his coffee. "Of death? Of heaven or hell?" The smile was genuine. "No, gentleman and lady, I wish I could say I did. I remember pain, eternities of pain, and then release, and then darkness, and then awakening here. How many years did you say have passed?" "Almost 12," said the consul, "but only about half that for Father Hoyt. He spent time in transit." Father Duray stood, stretched, and paced back and forth. He was a tall man, thin, but with a sense of strength about him, and Braun Lamia found herself impressed by his presence, by that strange, inexplicable charisma of personality which had cursed and bestowed power upon a few individuals since time immemorial. She had to remind herself that, first, he was a priest of a cult that demanded celibacy from its clerics, and, second, an hour earlier he had been a corpse. Lamia watched the older man pace up and down, his movements as elegant and relaxed as a cat's, and she realized that both observations were true, but neither could counteract the personal magnetism the priest radiated. She wondered if the men sensed it. Duray sat on a boulder, stretched his legs straight ahead of him, and rubbed at his thighs as if trying to get rid of a cramp. "You've told me something about who you are, why you are here," he said. "Can you tell me more?" The pilgrims glanced at one another. Duray nodded. "Do you think that I'm a monster myself? Some agent of the Shrike? I wouldn't blame you if you did." "We don't think that," said Braun Lamia. "The Shrike needs no agents to do his bidding. Besides, we know you from Father Hoyt's story, from you and your journals." She glanced at the others. "We found it difficult to tell our stories of why we have come to Hyperion. It would be all but impossible to repeat them." "I made notes on my comlog," said the consul. "They're very condensed, but it should make some sense out of our histories, and the history of the last decade of the hegemony. why the web is at war with the ousters, that sort of thing. You're welcome to access it if you wish. It shouldn't take more than an hour. And as anyone listening who's been listening to this up until now knows, that's nonsense. It takes many hours to retell those tales.
Although he says it's been condensed, so maybe it's just the Cliff's Notes. So instead of taking like 40 hours, it takes, oh, say 20.
Sorry. I would appreciate it, said Father Duray, and followed the consul back into the Sphinx. Braun Lamia, Sol, and Silenus walked to the head of the valley. From the saddle between the low cliffs they could see the dunes and barrens stretching toward the mountains of the Bridle Range, less than 10 clicks to the southwest. The broken globes, soft spires, and shattered gallerias of the dead city of poets were visible only 2 or 3 clicks to their right, along a broad ridge which the desert was quietly invading. "I'll walk back to the keep and find some rations," said Lamia.
"I hate to split up the group," said Sol. "We could all return."
"We could all return?" Martin Silenus folded his arms.
"Somebody should stay here in case the colonel returns."
"Before anyone leaves," said Sol, "I think we should search the rest of the valley. The consul didn't check far beyond the monolith this morning."
"I agree," said Lamia. "Let's get to it before it gets too late. I want to get provisions at the keep and return before nightfall." They had descended to the Sphinx when Duray and the consul emerged. The priest held the consul's spare comlog in one hand. Lamia explained the plan for a search, and the 2 men agreed to join them. Once again they walked the halls of the Sphinx, the beams from their hand torches and pencil lasers illuminating sweating stone at bizarre angles. Emerging into noontime sunlight, they made the 300-meter hike to the Jade Tomb. Lamia found herself shivering as they entered the room where the Shrike had appeared the night before. Hoyt's blood had left a rust-brown stain on the green ceramic floors. There was no sign of the transparent opening to the labyrinth below. There was no sign of the Shrike. The obelisk had no rooms, merely a central shaft in which a spiral ramp, too steep for human comfort, twisted upward between ebony walls. Even whispers echoed here, and the group kept talk to a minimum. There were no windows, no view, at the top of the ramp, 50 meters above the stone floor, and their torch beams illuminated only blackness as the roof curved in above them. Fixed ropes and chains left over from 2 centuries of tourism allowed them to descend without undue fear of a slip and fall that would end in death below. As they paused at the entrance, Martin Silenus called Cassad's name a final time, and the echoes followed them into sunlight. They spent half an hour or more inspecting the damage near the crystal monolith. Puddles of sand turned to glass, some 5 to 10 meters across, prismed the noonday light, and reflected heat in their faces. The broken face of the monolith, pocked now with holes and still dangling strands of melted crystal, looked like the target of an act of mindless vandalism, but each knew that Cassad must have been fighting for his life. There was no door, no opening to the honeycomb maze within. Instruments told them that the interior was as empty and unconnected as it always had been. They left reluctantly, climbing the steep trails to the base of the north cliffs where the cave tombs lay separated by less than 100 meters each.
"Early archaeologists thought that these were the oldest of the tombs because of their crudeness,"
said Saul, as they entered the first cave, sent flashlight beams playing across stone carved in 1,000 indecipherable patterns. None of the caves was deeper than 30 or 40 meters. Each ended in a stone wall that no amount of probing or radar imaging had ever discovered an extension to. Upon exiting the 3rd cave tomb, my epiglottis is doing something strange. What's going on? Where were we? Upon exiting the 3rd cave tomb, the group sat in what little shade they could find, and shared water and protein biscuits from Cassad's extra field rations. The wind had risen, and now it sighed and whispered through fluted rock high above them.
We're not gonna find 'em," said Martin Silenus. "The fucking Shrike took 'em."
Sol was feeding the baby with one of the last nursing packs. The top of her head had been turned pink by the sun, despite Sol's every effort to shield her as they walked outside.
"He could be in one of the tombs we were in," he said, "if there are sections out of time phase with us. That's Arundez's theory. He sees the tombs as four-dimensional constructs with intricate folds through space-time."
Great, said Lamia. So even if Fedman Kassad is there, we won't see him.
Well, said
the consul, getting to his feet with a tired sigh. Let's at least go through the motions. One tomb left. The Shrike Palace was a kilometer farther down the valley, lower than the others and hidden by a bend in the cliff walls. The structure was not large, smaller than the Jade Tomb, but its intricate construction, flanges, spires, buttresses, and support columns arching and arcing in controlled chaos, made it seem larger than it was. The interior of the Shrike Palace was one echoing chamber with an irregular floor made up of thousands of curving, jointed segments, which reminded Lamia of the ribs and vertebrae of some fossilized creature. 15 meters overhead, the dome was crisscrossed by dozens of the chrome blades, which continued through walls and each other to emerge as steel-tipped thorns above the structure. The material of the dome itself was slightly opaque, giving a rich, milky hue to the vaulted space. Lamia, Silenus, the consul, Weintraub, and Duray all began to shout for Kassad, their voices echoing and resonating, to no avail. No sign of Kassad or Hetmastin, said the consul as they emerged. Perhaps this will be the pattern, each of us disappearing until only one remains. And does that final one get his or her wish as the Shrike cult legends foretell? Asked Braun Lamia. She sat on the rocky hearth to the Shrike Palace, her short legs dangling in air. Paul Duray raised his face to the sky.
"I can't believe that it was Father Hoyt's wish that he would die so that I could live again."
Martin Silenus squinted up at the priest.
"So what would your wish be, Padre?"
Duray did not hesitate.
"I would pray, that God will lift the scourge of these twin obscenities, the war and the Shrike, from mankind once and for all."
There was a silence in which the early afternoon wind inserted its distant sighs and moans. "In the meantime," said Braun Lamia, "we've got to get some food or learn how to subsist on air." Duray nodded.
"Why did you bring so little with you?"
Martin Silenus laughed and said loudly,
"Ne cared for wine or half and half, ne cared he for fish or flesh or fowl, and sauces held he worthless as the chaff. He stained the swineherd and the wassail bowl, ne with lewd ribalds he sat he cheek by jowl, ne with sly lemons in the scorner's chair, but after Waterbrooks this pilgrim's soul panted, and all his food was woodland air, though he would ofttimes feast on gilliflowers rare."
Duray smiled, obviously still puzzled. "We all expected to triumph or die the first night," said the consul. "We hadn't anticipated a long stay here." Braun Lamia stood and brushed off her trousers. "I'm going," she said. "I should be able to carry back 4 or 5 days' rations if they're field food packs or the bulk stored items we saw."
"I'll go too,"
said Martin Silenus. There was a silence. During the week of their pilgrimage, the poet and Lamia had almost come to blows half a dozen times. Once she had threatened to kill the man. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said at last. "Let's stop by the Sphinx to get our packs and water bottles." The group moved up the valley as the shadows began to grow from the western walls. Chapter 17. 12 hours earlier, Colonel Fedman Kassad stepped off the spiral staircase onto the highest remaining level of the crystal monolith. Flames rose on all sides. Through gaps he had inflicted on the crystal surface of the structure, Kassad could see darkness. The storm blew vermilion dust through the apertures until it filled the air like powdered blood. Kassad pulled his helmet on. 10 paces in front of him, Moneta awaited. She was nude under the energy skin suit, and the effect was of quicksilver poured directly on flesh. Kassad could see the flames reflected in the curves of breast and thigh, the bend of light into the hollow of throat and navel. Her neck was long, her face chrome-carved in perfect smoothness. Her eyes held twin reflections of the tall shadow that was Fedman Kassad. Kassad raised the assault rifle and clicked the selector manually to full spectrum fire. Inside his activated impact armor, his body clenched in anticipation of attack. Moneta moved her hand, and the skin suit faded from the crown of her head to her neck. She was vulnerable now. Kassad felt that he knew every facet of that face, every pore and follicle. Her brown hair was cut short, falling softly to the left. The eyes were the same, large, curious, startling in their green depths. The small mouth with the full underlip still hesitated on the edge of a smile. He noted the slightly inquisitive arch of eyebrows, the small ears he had kissed and whispered in so many times, the soft throat where he had lain his cheek to listen to her pulse. Kassad raised the rifle and aimed it at her. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was as soft and sensual as he remembered, the slight accent as elusive. The finger on the trigger, Kassad paused. They had made love scores of times, known each other for years in his dreams and their lovers' landscape of the military simulations. But if she were truly moving backward in time... "I know," she said, her voice calm, apparently unaware of the pressure he had already begun to exert on the trigger. "You are the one whom the Lord of Pain has promised." Kassad was gasping for air. When he spoke, his voice was raw and very strained. "You don't remember me?" "No." She cocked her head to look at him quizzically. "But the Lord of Pain has promised a warrior. We were destined to meet." "We met long ago," managed Kassad. The rifle would automatically aim for the face, shifting wavelengths and frequencies every microsecond until the skin suit defenses were defeated. Along with the hell whip and laser beams, flechettes and pulse bolts would be fired an instant later. "I have no memory of long ago," she said. "We move in opposite directions along the general flow of time. What name do you know me by in my future, your past?" "Moneta," gasped Kassad, willing his straining hand and finger to fire. She smiled, nodded. "Moneta, the child of memory. There is a crude irony there." Kassad remembered her betrayal, the changing as they made love that last time in the sands above the dead city of poets. She had either become the Shrike or allowed the Shrike to take her place. It had turned an act of love into an obscenity. Colonel Kassad pulled the trigger. Moneta blinked. "It will not work here, not within the crystal monolith. Why do you wish to kill me?" Kassad growled, threw the useless weapon across the landing, directed power to his gauntlets, and charged. Moneta made no move to escape. She watched him charge the 10 paces. His head was down, his impact armor moaning as it changed the crystal alignment of polymers, and Kassad was screaming. She lowered her arms to meet the charge. Kassad's speed and mass knocked Moneta off her feet and sent both of them tumbling. Kassad trying to get his gauntleted hands on her throat, Moneta holding his wrists in a vice-strong grip as they rolled across the landing to the edge of the platform. Kassad rolled on top of her, trying to let gravity add to the force of his attack, arms straight, gauntlets rigid, fingers curved in a killing cusp. His left leg hung over the 60-meter drop to the dark floor below. "Why do you want to kill me?" whispered Moneta, and rolled him to one side, tumbling both of them off the platform. Kassad screamed and flipped down his visor with a snap of his head. They tumbled through space, their legs entwined around each other's bodies in fierce scissor grips. Kassad's hands held at bay by her death hold on his wrists. Time seemed to decelerate until they fell in slow motion, the air moving across Kassad like a blanket being pulled slowly over his face. Then time accelerated, grew normal. They were falling the last 10 meters. Kassad shouted and visualized the proper symbol to let his impact armor go rigid, and there was a terrible crash. From a blood-red distance, Fedman Kassad fought to the surface of consciousness, knowing that only a second or two had elapsed since they had struck the ground. He staggered to his feet. Moneta was also rising slowly, on one bent knee now, staring at the ground where the ceramic floor had been shattered by their fall. Kassad sent power to the servo mechanisms in his suit leg and kicked her at her head with full force. Moneta dodged the blow, caught his leg, twisted, and sent him crashing into the 3-meter square of crystal, shattering it, tumbling him out into the sand and the night. Moneta touched her neck, her face flowed with quicksilver, and she stepped out after him. Kassad flipped up his shattered visor, removed the helmet. The wind tousled his short black hair, and sand grated against his cheeks. He got to his knees, his feet. Telltales in the suit's collar display were blinking red, announcing the last reservoirs of power draining away. Kassad ignored the alarms. There would be enough for the next several seconds, and that would be all that mattered. "Whatever happened to you in my future, your past," said Moneta. "It was not I who changed. I am not the Lord of Pain. Kassad jumped the 3 meters that separated them, landed behind Moneta, and brought the killing gauntlet on his right hand around in an arc that broke the sound barrier, palm edge rigid and sharp as carbon piezo. What the blank? Why is there carbon twice? Anyway, Kassad jumped the 3 meters that separated them, landed behind Moneta, and brought the killing gauntlet on his right hand around in an arc that broke the sound barrier, palm edge rigid and sharp as carbon piezoelectric filaments could make it. Moneta did not duck or attempt to block the attack. Kassad's gauntlet caught the base of her neck in a blow which would have severed a tree, carved through half a meter of stone. On Brescia, in hand-to-hand combat in the capital of Buckminster, Kassad had killed an ouster colonel so quickly, his gauntlet cutting through impact armor, helmet, personal force field, flesh and bone without pause, that the man's head had blinked up at his own body for 20 seconds before death claimed him. Kassad's blow struck true, but stopped at the surface of the quicksilver skin suit. Moneta did not stagger or react. Kassad felt his suit power fail at the same instant his arm went numb, his shoulder muscle wrenching in agony. He staggered back, his right arm dead at his side, the suit power draining like blood from an injured man. "You don't listen," said Moneta. She stepped forward, grabbed Kassad by the front of his combat suit, and threw him 20 meters toward the Jade Tomb. He landed hard, the impact armor stiffening to absorb only part of the collision as power reserves failed. His left arm protected his face and neck, but then the armor locked up, his arm bent uselessly under him. Moneta jumped the 20 meters, crouched next to him, lifted him into the air with one hand, grabbed a handful of impact armor with the other hand, and ripped his combat suit down the front, tearing apart 200 layers of microfilaments and omega cloth polymers. She slapped him gently, almost lackadaisically. Kassad's head snapped around, and he almost lost consciousness. Wind and sand pelted the bare flesh of his chest and belly. Moneta tore the rest of the suit off, ripping off biosensors and feedback teeps. She lifted the naked man by his upper arms and shook him. Kassad tasted blood, and red dots swam in his field of vision. "We didn't have to be enemies," she said softly. "You fired at me." "To test your responses, not to kill you." Her mouth moved normally under its quicksilver caul. Cowl? C-A-U-L? I don't actually know how that's pronounced. I'm assuming it's cowl adjacent. Because a cowl, I've seen cowl spelled C-O-W-L, and that's usually like a hood. Slash cape arrangement, and this would kind of apply contextually. Anyway, let's take the sentence from the top. Her mouth moved normally under its quicksilver cowl. She slapped him again, and Kassad flew 2 meters in the air to land on a dune, rolled downhill in the cold sand. The air was filled with a million specks, snow, dust, pinwheels of colored light. Kassad rolled over, fought his way to his knees, gripping the shifting dune sand with fingers turned to numbed claws. "Kassad," whispered Moneta. He rolled onto his back, waiting. She had deactivated the skin suit. Her flesh looked warm and vulnerable, the skin so pale as to be almost translucent. There were soft blue veins visible along the tops of her perfect breasts. Her legs looked strong, carefully sculpted, the thighs separated slightly where they met her body. Her eyes were a dark green. "You love war, Kassad," whispered Moneta as she lowered herself onto him. He struggled, tried to twist aside, raised his arms to strike her. Moneta pinned his arms above his head with one of her hands. Her body was radiant with heat as she brushed her breasts back and forth across his chest, lowered herself between his parted legs. Kassad could feel the slight curve of her belly against his abdomen. He realized then that this was a rape, and he could fight back simply by not responding, refusing her. It did not work. The air seemed liquid around them, the windstorm a distant thing, sand hanging in the air like a lace curtain borne aloft by steady breezes. Moneta moved back and forth above him, against him. Kassad could feel the slow, clockwise stir of his excitement. He fought it, fought her, wrestled and kicked and struggled to free his arms. She was much stronger. She used her right knee to brush his leg aside. Her nipples rubbed across his chest like warm pebbles. The warmth of her belly and groin made his flesh react like a flower twisting toward the light. "No!" screamed Fedman Kassad, but was silenced as Moneta lowered her mouth to his. With her left hand, she continued to pin his arms above him. With her right hand, she moved between them, found him, guided him. Kassad bit at her lip as warmth enveloped him. His struggles brought him closer, sent him deeper into her. He tried to relax, and she lowered herself on him until his back was pressed into the sand. He remembered the other times they had made love, finding sanity in each other's warmth, while war raged beyond the circle of their passion. Kassad closed his eyes, arched his neck back to postpone the agony of pleasure which closed on him like a wave. He tasted blood on his lips, whether his or hers he did not know. A minute later, the two of them still moving together, Kassad realized that she had released his arms. Without hesitating, he brought both arms down, around, fingers flat against her back, and roughly pressed her closer to him. Slid one hand higher to cup the back of her neck with gentle pressure. The wind resumed, sound returned, sand blew from the edge of the dune in curls of spindrift. Cassad and Moneta slid lower on the gently curling bank of sand, rolled together down the warm wave to the place where it would break, oblivious of the night, the storm, the forgotten battle, and everything except the moment and each other. Later, walking together through the shattered beauty of the crystal monolith, she touched him once with a golden ferule, once more with a blue torus. He watched in the shard of a crystal panel as his reflection became a quicksilver sketch of a man, perfect down to the details of his gender and the lines where his ribs showed on the slender torso. "What now?" asked Cassad through the medium that was neither telepathy nor sound.
The Lord of Pain awaits.
"You are its servant?"
Never. I am his consort and nemesis, his keeper.
"You came from the future with it?"
No, I was taken from my time to travel back in time with him.
"Then who were you before—" Cassad's question was interrupted by the sudden appearance— no, he thought, the sudden presence, not appearance, of the Shrike. The creature was as he remembered it from their first encounter years before. Cassad noticed the quicksilver over chrome slickness of the thing, so similar to their own skin suits, but he knew intuitively that there was no mere flesh and bone beneath that carapace. It stood at least 3 meters tall, the 4 arms seemed normal on the elegant torso, and the body was a sculpted mass of thorns, spikes, joints, and layers of ragged razor wire. The 1,000-faceted eyes burned with a light that might have been made by a ruby laser. The long jaw and layers of teeth were the stuff of nightmare. Cassad stood ready. If the skin suit gave him the same strength and mobility it had afforded Moneta, he might at least die fighting. There was no time for that. One instant the Lord of Pain stood 5 meters away across black tile, and the next instant it was beside Cassad, gripping the colonel's upper arm in a steel-bladed vice that sank through the skin suit field and drew blood from his biceps. Cassad tensed, waiting for the blow and determined to strike back even though to do so meant impaling himself on blades, thorns, and razor wire. The Shrike lifted its right hand, and a 4-meter rectangular field portal came into existence. It was similar to a Farcaster portal, except for the violet glow which filled the interior of the monolith with thick light. Moneta nodded at him and stepped through. The Shrike stepped forward, finger blades cutting only slightly into Cassad's upper arm. Cassad considered pulling back, realized that curiosity was stronger in him than an urge to die, and stepped through with the Shrike. Chapter 18. CEO Maina Gladstone could not sleep. She rose, dressed quickly in her dark apartments deep in Government House, and did what she often did when sleep would not come. She walked the worlds. Her private Farcaster portal pulsed into existence. Gladstone left her human guards sitting in the anteroom, taking with her only one of the micro-remotes. She would have taken none if the laws of the hegemony and the rule of the Technocore would allow it. They did not. It was far past midnight on TC Squared, but she knew that many of the worlds would be in daylight, so she wore a long cape with a Renaissance privacy collar. Her trousers and boots revealed neither gender nor class, although the quality of the cape itself might mark her in some places. CEO Gladstone stepped through the one-time portal, sensing rather than seeing or hearing the micro-remote as it buzzed through behind her, climbing for altitude and invisibility as she stepped out into the square of St. Peter's in the new Vatican on Pacem. For a second she did not know why she had coded her implant for that destination. The presence of that obsolete Monsignor at the dinner on God's Grove? But then she realized that she had been thinking of the pilgrims as she lay awake, thinking of the 7 who left 3 years earlier to meet their fate on Hyperion. Pacem had been the home of Father Lenar Hoyt, and the other priest before him, Duray. Gladstone shrugged under the cape and crossed the square. Visiting the home worlds of the pilgrims was as good a schematic for her walk as any. Most sleepless nights saw her walking a score of worlds, returning just before dawn and the first meetings on Tau Ceti Center. At least this would be but 7 worlds. It was early here. The skies of Pacem were yellow, tinged with greenish clouds and an ammonia smell which attacked her sinuses and made her eyes water. The air had that thin, foul chemical smell of a world neither completely terraformed nor totally inimical to man. Gladstone paused to look around. St. Peter's was on a hilltop, the square embraced by a semicircle of pillars, a great basilica at its cusp. To her right, where the pillars opened to a staircase descending a kilometer or more to the south, a small city was visible, low, crude homes huddling between bone-white trees that resembled the skeletons of stunted creatures long since departed. Only a few people could be seen, hurrying across the square or ascending the stairs as if late for services. Bells somewhere under the great dome of the cathedral began to toll, but the thin air leached the sound of any authority. Gladstone walked the circle of pillars, head down, ignoring the curious glances of clerics and the street-sweeping crew, who rode a beast resembling a half-ton hedgehog. There were scores of marginal worlds like Pacem in the web, more in the Protectorate and nearby Outback. Too poor to be attractive to an infinitely mobile citizenry, too Earth-like to be ignored during the dark days of the Hegira. It had fit a small group like the Catholics, who had come here seeking a resurgence of faith. They had numbered in the millions then, Gladstone knew. There could be no more than a few tens of thousands now. She closed her eyes and recalled dossier hollows of Father Paul Duray. Gladstone loved the web. She loved the human beings in it. For all their shallowness and selfishness and inability to change, they were the stuff of humankind. Gladstone loved the web. She loved it enough to know that she must help in destroying it. She returned to the small 3-portal Terminex, brought her own Farcaster Nexus into existence with a simple override command to the datasphere, and stepped through into sunlight and the smell of the sea. Maui Covenant. Gladstone knew precisely where she was. She stood on the hill above First Sight, where Ceres' tomb still marked the spot where the short-lived rebellion had begun the better part of a century ago. At that time, First Sight was a village of a few thousand, and each festival week flutists welcomed the motile isles as they were herded north to their feeding grounds in the equatorial archipelago. Now First Sight stretched out of view around the island, arc towns and residential hives rising half a kilometer in all directions, towering over the hill which had once commanded the best view on the sea world of Maui Covenant. But the tomb remained. The body of the consul's grandmother was no longer there, never really had been there. But like so many symbolic things from this world, the empty crypt commanded reverence, almost awe. Gladstone looked out between the towers, out past the old breakwater where blue lagoons had been turned brown, out past the drilling platforms and tourist barges, out to where the sea began. There were no motile isles now. They no longer moved in great herds across the oceans, their tree sails billowing to southern breezes, their dolphin herders cutting the water in white V's of foam. The isles were tamed and populated by Webb's citizens now. The dolphins were dead. some killed in the great battles with force, most killing themselves in the inexplicable South Sea mass suicide, the last mystery of a race draped in mysteries. Gladstone took a seat on a low bench near the cliff's edge and found a stalk of grass she could peel and chew. What happened to a world when it went from a home for 100,000 humans, in delicate balance with a delicate ecology, to the playground for more than 400 million in the first standard decade of citizenship in the hegemony? Answer: the world died. Or its soul did, even as the ecosphere continued to function after a fashion. Planetary ecologists and terraform specialists kept the husk alive, kept the seas from choking completely on the unavoidable garbage and sewage and oil spills, worked to minimize or disguise the noise pollution and a thousand other things which progress had brought. But the Maui Covenant and the Consul had known but the Maui Covenant that the Consul had known as a child less than a century earlier, climbing this very hill to his grandmother's funeral, was gone forever. A formation of hawking mats flew overhead, the tourists on them laughing and shouting. Far above them, a massive excursion EMV occluded the sun for a moment. In the sudden shadow, Gladstone tossed down her stalk of grass and rested her forearms on her knees. She thought of the Consul's betrayal. She had counted on the Consul's betrayal, had wagered everything on the man raised on Maui Covenant, descendant of Siri, joining the ousters in the inevitable battle for Hyperion. It had not been her plan alone. Leigh Hunt had been instrumental in the decades of planning, the delicate surgery of placing the precise individual in contact with the ousters, in a position where he might betray both sides by activating the ouster device to collapse the time tides on Hyperion. And he had. The Consul, a man who had given 4 decades of his life as well as his wife and child to hegemony service, had finally exploded in revenge like a bomb which had lain dormant for half a century. Gladstone took no pleasure in the betrayal. The Consul had sold his soul and would pay a terrible price. In history, in his own mind. But his treason was as nothing to the treachery Gladstone was prepared to suffer for. As Hegemony CEO, she was the symbolic leader of 150 billion human souls. She was prepared to betray them all in order to save humanity. She rose, felt age and rheumatism in her bones, and walked slowly to the Terminex. She paused a moment by the gently humming portal, looking over her shoulder for a final glimpse of Maui Covenant. The breeze carried in from the sea, but it carried the flat stench of oil spills and refinery gases, and Gladstone turned her face away. The weight of Lusus fell on her caped shoulders like iron shackles. It was rush hour in the concourse, and thousands of commuters, shopkeepers, and tourists commuters, shoppers, and tourists crowded every walkway level, filled the kilometer-long escalators with colorful humanity, and gave the air a rebreathed heaviness that mixed with the sealed system scent of oil and ozone. Excuse me. Gladstone ignored the expensive shopping levels and took a purse trans discway the 10 clicks to the main Shrike Temple. There were police interdiction and containment fields glowing violet and green beyond the base of the wide stairway. The temple itself was boarded and dark. Many of the tall, thin, stained glass windows facing the concourse had been shattered. Gladstone remembered the reports of riots months before, and knew that the bishop and his acolytes had fled. She walked close to the interdiction field, staring through the shifting violet haze at the stairway where Braun Lamia had carried her dying client and lover, the original Keats Cybrid, to the waiting Shrike priests. Gladstone had known Braun's father well. They had spent their early Senate years together. Senator Byron Lamia had been a brilliant man, At one time, long before Braun's mother had come on the social scene from her backwater province of Freeholm, Gladstone had considered marrying him. And when he died, part of Gladstone's youth had been buried with him. Byron Lamia had been obsessed with the Technocore, consumed with the mission of moving humankind out from under the bondage the AIs had imposed over 5 centuries and 1,000 light years. It had been Braun Lamia's father who had made Gladstone aware of the danger, had led her to the commitment which would result in the most terrible betrayal in the history of man. And it was Senator Byron Lamia's suicide that had trained her to decades of caution. Gladstone did not know if it had been agents of the Corps that had orchestrated the senator's death. Perhaps it had been elements of the hegemony hierarchy protecting its own vested interests. But she did know that Byron Lamia would never have taken his own life, never have abandoned his helpless wife and headstrong daughter in such a way. Senator Lamia's last Senate act had been to propose protectorate status for Hyperion, a move that would have brought the world into the web 20 standard years earlier than the events now unfolding. After his death, the surviving co-sponsor, the newly influential Maina Gladstone, had withdrawn the bill. Gladstone found a drop shaft and fell past shopping levels and residential levels, manufacturing and service levels, waste disposal, and reactor levels. Both her comlog and the dropshaft speaker began warning her that she was entering unlicensed and unsafe areas far beneath the hive. The dropshaft program tried to stop her ascent. She overrode the command and silenced the warnings. She continued to drop, past levels without panels or lights now, descending through a tangle of fiber optic spaghetti, heating and cooling ducts, and naked rock. Eventually, she stopped. Gladstone emerged into a corridor lighted only by distant glow globes and oily firefly paint. Water dripped from 1,000 cracks in ceilings and walls and accumulated in toxic puddles. Steam drifted from apertures in the wall that might be other corridors, or personal cubbies, or merely holes. Somewhere in the distance there was the ultrasonic scream of metal cutting metal. Closer, the electronic screeches of Nile music. Somewhere a man screamed and a woman laughed, her voice echoing metallically down shafts and conduits. There came the sound of a flechette rifle coughing. Dreg's Hive. Gladstone came to an intersection of cave corridors and paused to look around. Her micro-remote dipped and circled closer now, as insistent as an angered insect. It was calling for security backup. Only Gladstone's persistent override prevented its cry being heard. Dreg's Hive. This was where Braun Lamia and her cybrid lover had hidden for those last few hours before their attempt to reach the Shrike Temple. This was one of the myriad underbellies of the web, where the black market could provide anything from flashback to force-grade weapons, illegal androids to bootleg Poulsen treatments that would as likely kill you as give you another 20 years of youth. Gladstone turned right, down the darkest corridor. Something the size of a rat, but with many legs, scurried into a broken ventilator tube. Gladstone smelled sewage, sweat, the ozone of overworked datum plane decks, the sweet scent of handgun propellant, vomit, and the reek of low-grade pheromones mutated to toxins. She walked the corridors, thinking of the weeks and months to come, the terrible price the worlds would pay for her decisions, her obsessions. 5 youths, tailored by backroom arnists to the point that they were more animal than human, stepped into the corridor in front of Gladstone. She paused. The micro-remote dropped in front of her and neutralized its camouflage polymers. The creatures in front of her laughed, seeing only a machine the size of a wasp bobbing and darting in the air. It was quite possible that they were too far gone in the RNA tailoring even to recognize the device. 2 of them flicked open vibrades. One extended 10-centimeter-long steel claws. One flicked open a flechette pistol with rotating barrels. Gladstone did not want to fight. She knew, even if these dregs hive deadheads did not, that the micro could defend her from these 5 and 100 more. But she did not want someone killed simply because she chose the dregs as a place to take her walk. "Go away," she said. The youths stared. Yellow eyes, bulbous black eyes, hooded slits, and photoreceptive belly bands. In unison, but spreading into a half circle, they took 2 steps toward her. Mina Gladstone pulled herself erect, gathered her cape around her, and dropped the privacy collar enough so that they could see her eyes. "Go away," she said again. The youths paused. Feathers and scales vibrated to unseen breezes. On 2 of them, antennae quivered and thousands of small sensory hairs pulsed. They went away. Their departure was as silent and swift as their arrival. In a second there was no sound but water dripping, distant laughter. Gladstone shook her head, summoned her personal portal, and stepped through. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Warren Steele.
See you in an hour.
Saul Weintraub and his daughter had come from Barnard's world. Gladstone translated to a minor terminix in their hometown of Crawford. It was evening. Low, white homes set back on manicured lawns reflected Canadian Republic Revival sensibilities and farmers' practicality. The trees were tall, broad-limbed, and amazingly faithful to their old earth heritage. Gladstone turned away from the flow of pedestrians, most hurrying home after a workday elsewhere in the web, and found herself strolling down brick walkways past brick buildings, set around a grassy oval. To her left she caught glimpses of farm fields past a row of houses. Tall green plants, possibly corn, grew in softly sighing ranks that stretched to the distant horizon where the last arc of a huge red sun was setting. Gladstone walked through the campus, wondering if this had been the college where Saul had taught, but not curious enough to query the datasphere. Gas lamps were lighting themselves under the canopy of leaves, and the first stars were becoming visible in the gaps where sky faded from azure to amber to ebony. Gladstone had read Weintraub's book, The Abraham Dilemma, in which he analyzed the relationship between a God who demanded the sacrifice of a son and the human race who agreed to it. Weintraub had reasoned that the Old Testament Jehovah had not simply been testing Abraham, but had communicated in the only language of loyalty, obedience, sacrifice, and command that humankind could understand at that point in the relationship. Weintraub had dealt with the New Testament's message as a presage of a new stage in that relationship, a stage wherein mankind would no longer sacrifice its children to any god for any reason, but where parents, entire races of parents, would offer themselves up instead. Thus, the 20th century holocausts, the brief exchange, the tripartite wars, the reckless centuries, and perhaps even the big mistake of '38. Finally, Weintraub had dealt with refusing all sacrifice, refusing any relationship with God except one of mutual respect and honest attempts at mutual understanding. He wrote about the multiple deaths of God and the need for a divine resurrection now that humankind had constructed its own gods and released them on the universe. Gladstone crossed a graceful stony bridge arcing over a stream lost in shadows, its whereabouts indicated only by the noises it made in the dark. Soft yellow light fell on railings of hand-set stone. Somewhere off campus a dog barked and was hushed. Lights burned on the 3rd floor of an old building, a gabled and roughly shingled brick structure that must date back to before the Hegira. Gladstone thought about Saul Weintraub and his wife Sarai and their beautiful 26-year-old daughter, returning from a year of archaeological discovery on Hyperion, with no discovery except the Shrike's curse, the Merlin's sickness. Saul and Sarai watching as the woman aged backward to child, from child to infant. And then Saul watching alone after Sarai died in a senseless, stupid EMV crash while visiting her sister. Rachel Weintraub, whose first and final birthday would arrive in less than 3 standard days. Gladstone pounded her fist against stone, summoned her portal, and went elsewhere. Welcome, welcome. The gang's all here. It was midday on Mars. The Tharsis slums had been slums for 6 centuries and more. The sky overhead was pink, the air too thin and too cold for Gladstone, even with her cape around her, and dust blew everywhere. She walked the narrow lanes and cliff walks of Relocation City, never finding an open enough spot to see anything beyond the next cluster of hovels or dripping filter towers. There were few plants here. The great forests of the Greening had been cut down for firewood or died and been covered by red dunes. Only a few bootleg brandy cacti and scuttling packs of parasitic spider lichen were visible between paths packed hard as stone by 20 generations of bare feet. Gladstone found a low rock and rested, lowering her head and massaging her knees. Groups of children, each naked except for strips of rags and dangling shunt jacks, surrounded her, begged for money, and then ran away giggling when she did not respond. The sun was high. Mons Olympus and the stark beauty of Fedman Kassad's Force Academy were not visible from here. Gladstone looked around. This was where the proud man had come from. Here is where he had run with youth gangs before being sentenced to the order, sanity, and honor of the military. Gladstone found a private place and stepped through her portal. God's Grove was as it always was, perfumed by the scent of a million trees, silent except for the soft sounds of leaf rustle and wind, colored in halftones and pastels, the sunset igniting the literal rooftop of the world as an ocean of treetops caught the light, each leaf shimmering to the breeze, glittering with dew and morning showers as the breeze rose and carried the smell of rain and wet vegetation to Gladstone on her platform high above the world still sunk in sleep and darkness half a kilometer below. A Templar approached, saw the glint of Gladstone's access bracelet as she moved her hand, and withdrew, a tall, robed figure blending back into the maze of foliage and vines. The Templars were one of the trickiest variables in Gladstone's game. Their sacrifice of their tree-ship Yggdrasil was unique, unprecedented, inexplicable, and worrisome. Of all her potential allies in the war to come, none were more necessary and inscrutable than the Templars. Dedicated to life and devoted to the Muir, the Brotherhood of the Tree was a small but potent force in the web, a token of ecological awareness in a society devoted to self-destruction and waste, but unwilling to acknowledge its indulgent ways. Where was Het Mastine? Why had he left the Mobius cube with the other pilgrims? Gladstone watched the sun rise. The sky filled with orphan Montgolfiers? Montgolfiers. Montgolfiers. The sky filled with orphan Montgolfiers saved from the slaughter on Whirl, their many-hued bodies floating skyward like so many Portuguese men-o'-war. Radiant gossamers spread membrane-thin solar wings to collect the sunlight. A flock of ravens broke cover and spiraled skyward, their cries providing harsh counterpoint to the soft breeze and sibilant rush of rain coming toward Gladstone from the west. The insistent sound of raindrops on leaves reminded her of her own home in the deltas of Patafa, of the 100-day monsoon which sent her and her brothers out into the fens hunting for toad flyers, bendits, and Spanish moss serpents to bring to school in a jar. Gladstone realized for the 100,000th time that there was still time to stop things. All-out war was not inevitable at this point. The ousters had not counterattacked yet in a way the hegemony could not ignore. The Shrike was not free. Not yet. All she had to do to save 100 billion lives was return to the Senate floor, reveal 3 decades of deception and duplicity, reveal her fears and uncertainties. No, it would go as planned until it went beyond planning, into the unforeseen, into the wild waters of chaos where even the Technocore predictors, those who saw everything, would be blind. Gladstone walked the platforms, towers, ramps, and swinging bridges of the Templar Tree City. Arboreals from a score of worlds and arnied chimps scolded her and fled, swinging gracefully from flimsy vines 300 meters above the forest floor. From areas closed to tourists and privileged visitors, Gladstone caught the scent of incense and clearly heard the Gregorian-like chants of the Templar sunrise service. Beneath her, the lower levels were coming alive with light and movement. The brief showers had passed over, and Gladstone returned to the upper levels, rejoicing in the view, crossing a 60-meter wooden suspension bridge, connecting her tree to one even larger, where half a dozen of the great hot air balloons, the only air transport the Templars allowed on God's Grove, hung tethered and seemingly impatient to be away, their passenger nacelles swinging like heavy brown eggs, the skins of the balloons lovingly dyed in the patterns of living things. Montgolfiers, monarch butterflies, Thomas hawks, radiant gossamers, the now extinct zeppelins, sky squids, moon moths, eagles, so revered in legend that they had never been retrieved or arnied, and more. All this could be destroyed if I continue. Will be destroyed. Gladstone paused at the edge of a circular platform and gripped a railing so tightly that the age mottles on her hands stood out harshly against suddenly pale skin. She thought of the old books she had read, pre-Hegira, pre-spaceflight, where people in embryonic nations on the continent of Europe had transported darker people, Africans, away from their homelands into a life of slavery in the colonial West. Would those slaves, chained and shackled, naked and curled in the fetid belly of a slave ship, would those slaves have hesitated to rebel, to drag down their captors, if it meant destroying the beauty of that slave ship, of Europe itself? But they had Africa to return to. Maina Gladstone let out a sound part groan and part sob. She whirled away from the glorious sunrise, from the sound of chants greeting the new day, from the rise of balloons, living and artificial, into the newborn sky, and she went below, down into the relative darkness, to summon her Farcaster. She could not go where the last pilgrim, Martin Silenus, had come from. Silenus was only a century and a half old, half blue from Poulsen treatments, his cells remembering the cold freeze of a dozen long cryogenic fugues and even colder storage, but his lifetime had spanned more than 4 centuries. He had been born on old Earth during the last days there, his mother from one of the noblest families, his youth a pastiche of decadence and elegance, beauty and the sweet smell of decay. While his mother stayed with the dying Earth, he had been sent spaceward so that someone could clear family debts, even if it meant, which it did, years of service as a bonded manual laborer on one of the most hellish backwater worlds in the web. Gladstone could not go to Old Earth, so she went to Heaven's Gate. Mudflat was the capital, and Gladstone walked the cobblestone streets there, admiring the large old houses which overhung the narrow, stone-troughed canals crisscrossing their way up the artificial mountainside like something from an Escher print. Elegant trees and even larger horsetail ferns crowned the hilltops, lined the broad white avenues, and swept out of sight around the elegant curve of white sand beaches. The lazy tide brought in violet waves which prismed to a score of colors before dying on the perfect beaches. Gladstone paused at a park looking over the mudflat promenade, where scores of couples and carefully dressed tourists took the evening air under gas lamp and leaf shadow, and she imagined what Heaven's Gate had been more than 3 centuries earlier, when it was a rough protectorate world, not yet fully terraformed, and young Martin Silenus, still suffering from cultural dislocation, the loss of his fortune, and brain damage due to freezer shock on the long trip out, was working here as a slave. The atmospheric generating station, then, had provided a few hundred square kilometers of breathable air, marginally livable land. Tsunamis carried away cities, land reclamation projects, and workers with equal indifference. Bonded workers like Silenus dug out the acid canals, scraped rebreather bacteria from the lung pipe labyrinths under the mud, and dredged scum and dead bodies from the tidal mudflats after the floods.
We have made some progress, thought Gladstone, despite the inertia forced upon us by the core, despite the near death of science, despite our fatal addiction to the drugs, to the toys granted us by our own creation.
She was dissatisfied. Before this world walk was over, she had wanted to visit the home of each of the Hyperion pilgrims, however futile she knew the gesture to be. Heaven's Gate was where Silenus had learned to write true poetry, even while his temporarily damaged mind was lost to language. But this was not his home. Gladstone ignored the pleasant music rising from the concert on the promenade, ignored the flights of commuter EMVs moving overhead like migrating fowl, ignored the pleasant air and soft light, as she called her portal to her and commanded it to forecast to Earth's moon. The moon. Instead of activating the translation, her comlog warned her of the dangers of going there. She overrode it. Her micro-remote buzzed into existence, its tiny voice in her implant suggesting that it was not a good idea for the chief executive to travel to such an unstable place. She silenced it. The Farcaster portal itself began to argue with her choice until she used her universal card to program it manually. The Farcaster door blurred into existence, and Gladstone stepped through. The only place on Old Earth's moon still habitable was the mountain and mare area preserved for the Force Masada ceremony, and it was here that Gladstone stepped out. The viewing stands and marching field were empty. Class 10 containment fields blurred the stars and the distant rim walls. But Gladstone could see where the internal heating from terrible gravity tides had melted the distant mountains and made them flow into new seas of rock. She moved across a plain of gray sand, feeling the light gravity like an invitation to fly. She imagined herself as one of the Templar balloons, lightly tethered but eager to be away. She resisted the impulse to jump, to leap along in giant bounds, but her step was light, and dust flew in improbable patterns behind her. The air was very thin under the containment field dome, and Gladstone found herself shivering despite the heating elements in her cape. For a long moment she stood in the center of the featureless plain and tried to imagine just the moon, humankind's first step in its long stagger from the cradle.
But the force viewing stands and equipment sheds distracted her, made such imaginings futile, and finally she raised her eyes to see what she had actually come for. Old Earth hung in the black sky. But not old Earth, of course, merely the pulsing accretion disk and globular cloud of debris which had once been old Earth. It was very bright, brighter than any of the stars seen from Ptolemy, or even the rarest clear on even the rarest clear night. But its brightness was strangely ominous, and it cast a sick light across the mud-gray field. Gladstone stood and stared. She had never been here before, had made herself not come before. And now that she was here, she desperately wanted to feel something, hear something, as if some voice of caution or inspiration, or perhaps merely commiseration, would come to her here. She heard nothing. She stood there another few minutes, thinking of little, feeling her ears and nose beginning to freeze, before she decided to go. It would be almost dawn on TC squared. Gladstone had activated the portal and was taking a final look around when another portable Farcaster door blurred into existence less than 10 meters away. She paused. Not 5 human beings in the web had individual access to Earth's moon. The micro remote buzzed down to float between her and the figure emerging from the portal. Leigh Hunt stepped out, glanced around, shivered from the cold, and walked quickly toward her. His voice was thin, almost amusingly childlike in the thin air.
Chief Executive, you must return at once. The ousters have succeeded in breaking through in an amazing counterattack.
Gladstone sighed. She had known that this would be the next step.
All right, she said. Has Hyperion fallen? Can we evacuate our forces from there?
Hunt shook his head. His lips were almost blue from the cold.
You don't understand,
came the attenuated voice of her aide.
It's not just Hyperion. The ousters are attacking at a dozen points. They're invading the web itself.
Suddenly numb and chilled to her core, more from shock than from the lunar cold, Mina Gladstone nodded, gathered her cape more tightly around her, and stepped back through the portal to a world which would never be the same again. Chapter 19. They gathered at the head of the Valley of the Time Tombs, Braun Lamia and Martin Silenus burdened with as many backpacks and carrying bags as they could manage, Saul Weintraub, the consul, and Father Duray standing silent as a tribunal of patriarchs. The first shadows of afternoon were beginning to stretch east across the valley, reaching for the glowly softing. The first shadows of afternoon were beginning to stretch east across the valley, reaching for the softly glowing tombs like fingers of darkness. "I'm still not sure it's a good idea to split up like this," said the consul, rubbing his chin. It was very hot. Sweat gathered on his stubbled cheeks and ran down his neck. Lamia shrugged. "We knew that we each would be confronting the Shrike alone. Does it matter if we're separated for a few hours? We need the food. You three could come if you want." The consul and Saul glanced at Father Duray. The priest was obviously exhausted. The search for Cassad had drained whatever reserves of energy the man had kept after his ordeal. "Someone should wait here in case the colonel returns," said Saul. The baby looked very small in his arms. Lamia nodded agreement. She settled straps on her shoulders and neck. "All right. It should be about 2 hours getting to the keep. A little longer coming back. Figure a full hour there loading supplies, and we'll still be back before dark, close to dinner time. The consul and de Rey shook hands with Silenus. Saul put his arms around Braun. "Come back safely," he whispered. She touched the bearded man's cheek, set her hand on the infant's head for a second, turned, and started up the valley at a brisk pace.
Hey, wait a fucking minute for me to catch up,
called Martin Silenus, canteens and water bottles clattering as he ran. They came up out of the saddle between the cliffs together. Silenus glanced back and saw the other 3 men already dwarfed by distance, small sticks of color amid the boulders and dunes near the Sphinx.
It isn't going quite as planned, is it?
He said. I don't know, said Lamia. She had changed into shorts for the hike, and the muscles of her short, powerful legs gleamed under a sheen of sweat. How was it planned?
My plan was to finish the universe's greatest poem and then go home, said Silenus.
He took a drink from the last bottle, holding water.
God damn, I wish we'd brought enough wine to last us.
I didn't have a plan, said Lamia, half to herself. I didn't have a plan, said Lamia half to herself. Her short curls, matted with perspiration, clung to her broad neck. Martin Silenus snorted a laugh.
You wouldn't be here if it weren't for that cyborg lover.
Client, she snapped.
Whatever. It was the Johnny Keats retrieval persona who thought it was important to get here. So now you've dragged him this far. You're still carrying the Schroen loop, aren't you?
Lamia absently touched the tiny neural shunt behind her left ear. A thin membrane of osmotic polymer kept sand and dust out of the follicle-sized connector sockets. Yes. Silenus laughed again.
What the fuck good is it if there's no data sphere to interact with, kid? You might as well have left the Keats persona on Lucis or wherever.
The poet paused a second to adjust straps and packs.
Say, can you access the personality on your own?
Lamia thought of her dreams the night before. The presence in them had felt like Johnny, but the images had been of the web. Memories? No, she said. I can't access a Schroen loop by myself. It carries more data than 100 simple implants could deal with. Now why don't you shut up and walk? She picked up the pace and left him standing there. The sky was cloudless, verdant, and hinting of depths of lapis. The boulder field ahead stretched southwest to the barrens surrendering to the dune fields. The 2 walked in silence for 30 minutes, separated by 5 meters and their thoughts. Hyperion's sun hung small and bright to their right. The dunes are steeper, said Lamia as they struggled up to another crest and slid down the other side. The surface was hot, and already her shoes were filling with sand. Silenus nodded, stopped, and mopped his face with a silken handkerchief. His floppy purple beret hung low over his brow and left ear, but offered no shade.
It would be easier following the high ground to the north there, near the dead city.
Braun Lamia shielded her eyes to stare in that direction. We'll lose at least half an hour going that way.
We'll lose more than that going this way.
Silenus sat on the dune and sipped from his water bottle. He pulled off his cape, folded it, and stuffed it in the largest of his backpacks. What are you carrying there? Asked Lamia. That pack looks full.
None of your damned business, woman.
Lamia shook her head, rubbed her cheeks, and felt the sunburn there. She was not used to so many days in sunlight, and Hyperion's atmosphere blocked little of the ultraviolet. She fumbled in her pocket for the tube of sunblock cream and smeared some on. All right, she said, we'll detour that way. Follow the ridgeline until the worst of the dunes are passed, and then cut back on a straight line toward the keep. The mountains hung on the horizon, seeming to grow no closer. The snow-topped summits tantalized her with their promise of cool breezes and fresh water. The valley of the time tombs was invisible behind them, the view blocked by dunes and the boulder fields. Lamia shifted her packs, turned to her right, and half slid, half walked half walked down the crumbling dune. As they came up out of the sand onto the low gorse and needle grass of the ridge, Martin Silenus could not take his eyes from the ruins of the City of Poets. Lamia had cut left around it, avoiding everything but the stones of the half-buried highways that circled the city, other roads leading out into the barrens until they disappeared beneath the dunes. Silenus fell farther and farther behind, until he stopped and sat on a fallen column, which had once been a portal through which the android laborers filed every evening after working in the fields. Those fields were gone now. The aqueducts, canals, and highways only hinted at by fallen stones, depressions in the sand, or the sand-scoured stumps of trees where once they had overhung a waterway or shaded a pleasant lane. Martin Silenus used his beret to mop his face as he stared at the ruins. The city was still white as bones uncovered by shifting sands, as white as teeth in an earth-brown skull. From where he sat, Silenus could see that many of the buildings were as he had last seen them more than a century and a half ago. Poets' Amphitheatre lay half-finished but regal in its ruin, a white, otherworldly Roman Colosseum overgrown with desert creeper and fanfare ivy. The great atrium was open to the sky, the gallerias shattered. Not by time, Silenus knew, but by the probes and lances and explosive charges of sad King Billy's useless security people in the decades after the evacuation of the city. They were going to kill the Shrike. They were going to use the electronics and angry beams of coherent light to kill Grendel after he had laid waste to the mead hall. Martin Silenus chuckled and leaned forward, suddenly dizzy from the heat and exhaustion. Silenus could see the great dome of the common hall where he had eaten his meals, first with the hundreds in artistic camaraderie, then in separation and silence with the few others who had remained, for their own inscrutable and unrecorded reasons, after Billy's evacuation to Keats, and then alone. Truly alone. Once he had dropped a goblet and the echo rang for half a minute under the vine-graffitied dome. Alone with the Morlocks, thought Silenus, but not even Morlocks for company in the end. Only my muse. There was a sudden explosion of sound, and a score of white doves burst from some niche in the heap of broken towers that had been sad King Billy's palace. Silenus watched them whirl and circle in the overheated sky, marveling that they had survived the centuries here on the edge of nowhere. If I could do it, why not they? There were shadows in the city, pools of sweet shade. Silenus wondered if the wells were still good, the great underground reservoirs, sunk before the human seed ships had arrived, still filled with sweet water. He wondered if his wooden work table, an antique from old Earth, still sat in the small room in which he had written much of his cantos. What's wrong? Braun Lamia had retraced her steps and was standing near him. Nothing. He squinted up at her. The woman looked like some squat tree, a mass of dark thigh roots and sunburned bark and frozen energy. He tried to imagine her being exhausted. The effort made him tired. I just realized, he said, we're wasting our time going all the way back to the keep. There are wells in the city, probably food reserves too. Uh-huh, said Lamia. The consul and I thought of that, talked about it. The dead city's been looted for generations. Shrike pilgrims must have depleted the stores 60 or 80 years ago. The wells aren't dependable. The aquifer is shifted. The reservoirs are contaminated. We go to the keep. Oh, sorry. Said Lamia, not uh-huh. That changes the entire tenor of everything. My bad. Said Lamia. The consul and I thought of that, talked about it. The dead city's been looted for generations. Shrike pilgrims must have depleted the stores 60 or 80 years ago. The wells aren't dependable. The aquifer has shifted. The reservoirs are contaminated. We go to the keep. Silenus felt his anger grow at the woman's insufferable arrogance, her instant assumption that she could take command in any situation.
I'm going to explore, he said. It might save us hours of travel time.
Lamia moved between him and the sun. Her black curls glowed with the corona of eclipse. No, if we waste time here, we won't be back before dark.
Go on, then, snapped the poet,
Surprised at what he was saying.
I'm tired. I'm going to check out the warehouse behind the common hall. I might remember a storage places the pilgrims never found.
He could see the woman's body tense as she considered dragging him to his feet, pulling him out onto the dunes again. They were little more than a third of the way to the foothills where the long climb to the keep staircase began. Her muscles relaxed. Martin, she said, the others are dependent on us. Please, don't screw this up. He laughed and sat back against the tumbled pillar.
Fuck that, he said. I'm tired. You know that you're going to do 95% of the transporting anyway. I'm old, woman. Older than you can imagine. Let me stay and rest a while. Maybe I'll find some food. Maybe I'll get some writing done.
Lamia crouched next to him and touched his pack. That's what you've been carrying. The pages of your poem. The cantos.
Of course,
He said. And you still think that proximity to the shrike will allow you to finish it? Silenus shrugged, feeling the heat and dizziness whirl around him.
the thing is a fucking killer. A sheet metal Grendel forged in hell, he said. But it's my muse.
Lamia sighed, squinted at the sun already lowering itself toward the mountains, and then looked back the way they had come. Go back, she said softly, to the valley. She hesitated a moment. I'll go with you, then return. Silenus smiled with cracked lips.
Why go back? To play cribbage with 3 other old men until our beastie comes to tuck us in? No thanks. I'd rather rest here a bit and get some work done. Go on, woman. You can carry more than 3 poets could. More than 3 poets could.
He struggled out of his empty packs and bottles, handing them to her. Lamia held the tangle of straps in a fist as short and hard as the head of a steel hammer. Are you sure? We can walk slowly. He struggled to his feet, fueled by a moment of pure anger at her pity and condescension.
Fuck you and the horse you rode in on, Lucian. In case you forgot, the purpose of the pilgrimage was to get here and say hello to the Shrike. Your friend Hoyt didn't forget. Kassad understood the game. The fucking Shrike's probably chewing on his stupid military bones right now. I wouldn't be surprised if the 3 we left behind don't need food or water by this point. Go on, get the hell out of here. I'm tired of your company.
Braun Lamia remained crouching for a moment, looking up at him as he weaved above her. Then she got to her feet, touched his shoulder for the briefest of seconds, lifted the packs and bottles to her back, and swung away, her pace faster than anything he could have kept up with in his youth. I'll be back this way in a few hours, she called, not turning back to look at him. Be out on this edge of the city. We'll return to the tombs together. Martin Silenus said nothing as he watched her diminish and then disappear in the rough ground to the southwest. The mountains shimmered in the heat. He looked down and saw that she had left the water bottle for him. He spat, added the bottle to his load, and walked into the waiting shade of the dead city. And that'll do it for this week. A bit shorter this time, I know. But that ends us at a pretty decent spot and covers a lot of pretty dramatic events. Oh boy, next week's going to be a thriller. I'm pretty sure stuff goes down again next week. Things are going to escalate and accelerate from here on in.
You probably have guessed as much. The chapters are short and punchy. The perspective shift has occurred. Where were we? Yes, 580. Okay. Sorry, I'm just flipping ahead to see where I'm going to split off here. Put it there temporarily, and we'll go from there. Anyway, obviously, our band of pilgrims has never played a solid session of Dungeons and Dragons in their life, because they would have known rule one: don't split the party, and they have gone and been like, "Yeah, just everybody go wherever, it'll be fine." What's the worst that could happen, right? Right. Yeah, it'll be fine. It'll be nothing could possibly transpire here. No sirree, Bob. No tragic accidents. No, sir. There's no foreshadowing at all. um, but yeah, no. So things are moving along. The web's being invaded. Um, the whole web. Uh, Lenar Hoyt is dead, as we knew, but has come back, and it's Father Paul de Rey because of the extra cruciform. Um, Wild. It's a lot went down this chunk, and we're gonna have at like every segment or every chunk that we do is gonna have something wild happen, something dramatic, something irrevocable. Um, that's why we dig it. I hope people are enjoying it. I know I certainly am. I appreciate everyone who tunes in, live or otherwise. I don't care if you tune in live or watch them after the fact. I appreciate it if you tune in at all. Um, it's awesome. It's not what I would have expected uh, when I was starting to do this years and years ago. I'm glad it took. How many years has been? Uh, we've been doing this 4 years now. I can find out. I can't find out that way. I've got to find out the hard way. Oh, good. This is going to take me a minute. How do we get to the last one here? Oh, nice. That's not cooperating. Let's try it again. Here we go. Will you let me go to the last page? No? You're not? How useless is that? Let's try first. No. Good. YouTube's interface is just brilliant as ever. It doesn't make me kind of want to. Oh, here we go. We can set that to 50. That'll at least make it so that I only have to refresh the page 60 times. Give me a minute. This could be a while. There's got to be an easier way. Probably is. Oh, that's right. Because I have so many videos in there, I don't think it'll load them. Let's see. 2019, I guess. It would have been started 2019, so it's been 4 years, I guess. Cool. That's almost depressing. How much time has passed.
But we've had so much fun along the way, haven't we?
I know I have. Where are all the playlists? Why is it only list? Oh, that's dumb. This interface sucks. YouTube, do better. Google, do better. Happy Google. Anyway, hope people are still digging this. It's probably the most ambitious book I've read from a length and everything standpoint, character standpoint. Maybe not the most technically difficult book I've read. That's probably either something by Peter Watts or The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein. That was a genuinely difficult book to read aloud, and I still feel kind of bad about it. I think it could have been worse, but I think I could have done better in general. It is what it is. Anyway, um, yeah. So as ever, if this is the first time you've tuned in, hi. I do these live. If you're not tuned in live, if you're watching this after the fact, I do these live starting about noon Eastern Standard Time / US East Coast time every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Mondays are Mecha Mondays, where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Right now, we're reading through the. To place this in time, for anyone tuning in after the fact to know what was going on concurrently with these on Free Read Fridays. Mondays are Mecha Mondays. We're reading through the novelization of Mobile Suit Gundam by Yoshiyuki Tomino, the man, the myth, the legend. And now I have all my books falling everywhere, and I'm going to keep them from doing that. Very good. Um, Wednesdays are wordy Wednesdays for this year, at least. Um, I don't know if next year I'm going to continue to do all reading streams the entire year. We're going to find out. See how many books we can get through in one year. It's a lot. It's a lot. Used to be I only did the reading streams on Fridays and at one point early on Saturdays. But now it's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I did other streams on Mondays and Wednesdays, but now things are different. Things are ambitious. Things are whatever they are. It's a paradigm shift. It's fine. It is what it is. And then Fridays are free read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. Oh, Wednesdays I are wordy Wednesdays. I read whatever. Um, Tentatively gonna try and focus on making sure that's either reality adjacent or maybe I'll do fantasy stuff then as well. I'll reserve that as a kind of grab bag. Um, Articles as well, that sort of thing. Um, and then Free Read Fridays is where I read novels and short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. Right now we're reading through the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. We are in the second volume, The Fall of Hyperion. And things have gotten exciting, as you've probably seen. Right now during Wordy Wednesdays, I'm totally out of it right now. We're reading through Radicalized, the short story collection by Cory Doctorow. So if you want some tales from our present moment, some tales of rebellion against the powers that run our lives, against the systems that trap us in place in this current era, um, then definitely check those out. There's 4 stories in there, and they're all good. All of them. Rarely can I say that a short story collection has nothing but bangers in it. That's one of them. But yeah, after I finish the last 2 stories in there, I have no idea what I'm going to do for Wordy Wednesdays. Part of me wants to start doing a live narration read through of Legend of the Condor Heroes, which is this excellent, seminal, even Chinese fantasy / fiction novel series, which has been adapted and readapted again so many times it's ridiculous. If you've watched like any wuxia martial arts films, like martial fantasy films from the last 40 years, you have probably seen some partial adaptation or otherwise of Legend of the Condor Heroes. And I'd like to at least get through the first book, see if that works out well. I know I've thoroughly had fun reading them on my own time, and it's good stuff. Other than that, more Dr. O is probably on the table. He's nominally a science fiction author, I guess, but a lot of it is so close to present time that it really, I don't think it counts as sci-fi, honestly. It's kind of like oh, what's that trilogy by Gibson called? Oh my God! What were they called? Pattern Recognition, Spook Country, and Zero History, which are theoretically science fictiony, but like you wouldn't know it. Even at the time when they came out, they weren't particularly skiffy. They were very like tales of the present moment. Now they're like, oh yeah, that's stuff that we were doing and are doing. Nothing crazy there. Um, so that I might wind up doing as well. Those are not bad at all. I also want to get read a translation of Beowulf by Maria Davana Headley because it is a fun translation of Beowulf. Um, I also have a Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, so we could back to back those, I guess. That's going to be trickier because that's like hard. Oh my gosh. But good, obviously, but good. I'm not gonna read something on stream if I don't think it's good. If I think something is like outright bad, I'm not gonna read it on stream. I'm gonna find something else to do. Um, my reading of it might not be very good, but generally, as a rule, I also kind of want to do at least the first novel of the oh, what is that series called? By Peter V. Brett. The first novel is called The Warded Man. I just call it the Warded Man series, but I think it's got another name like the Demon Cycle or something. Um, which sounds awesome because it's like, oh wow, it's like a bicycle made of demons. That's neat. But it's not really like that. It's pretty good as far as fantasy goes, and he's kind of a lesser known fantasy author, although I think he's gotten some pretty solid acclaim in recent years. He keeps on trucking. He's not, a big name in the fantasy realm. I don't actually read mountains of fantasy. It's a distressing amount of my wall is science fiction, but not all of it. I try to be reasonably well-rounded. Right now, in my personal life, I'm reading through Judgment at Tokyo by Gary Bass. I think it's Gary Bass. Gary J. Bass, something like that. Um, which is talking. It's an actual historical not novel historical book on the Tokyo trials and kind of how they went down, the environment surrounding them, sociologically, politically, and just events, as well as impact that it had on the general Asian region in the wake of World War II. And I find very interesting parallels with how things kind of went down there as they did at the end of the American Civil War, in terms of meting out of justice or lack thereof in certain cases, many cases. Um, the reasons and rationales I feel for things being dicey, slipshod, for the Tokyo trial, I think makes a little more sense, if depressing sense, in the sense that the Soviet Union was on the rise and the Allies and particularly the United States were rather concerned about that development. But suffice it to say, it's good. It's very long, so I don't expect I'm ever going to read that on stream. It's not quite as dry as I was fearing, but it is fairly dry. For a non-dry historical book, I do want to read maybe a what is it called? Uncertain Union, and it's a book about John Fremont and his wife, um, Claire Benton, something Benton, last name Benton, daughter of a Missouri senator. Anyway, it's very that one is fascinating. That one's like absolutely phenomenal. It's very well written. It's entertaining, but also very revealing. So I do kind of want to read that one as well, if I can get around to it. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts about the near future, provided my schedule allows such things. And yeah, from there, after we finish with Fall of Hyperion, I'm probably going to either read a Greg Egan short story collection, um, or maybe I'll just get right into doing either the Destination Void series by Herbert and later Herbert and Bill Ransom, or coin tossing between that and the Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. I don't know how to pronounce Cixin Liu's name. I am guessing. I'm hoping that's half right. Anyway, that's where we're at. And after I get through any of those, that's going to be where I really have to soul search and figure out what I'm doing, because I that's going to take months, and I just haven't planned that far ahead. So that's enough of my blathering. With that, I'm going to dip. I have some food shopping to do. With that, I'm going to dip. Stay safe, stay sane, stay toasty or cool as per your preference and geological location permit, and be decent to each other as best you can. No, you know what? It's a mandate. I don't care. Do or do not. Do or do not. There is no try, and you'll be judged for your choice accordingly.
Ha! So there. Frag the hard ass. He's mean.
Anyway, I will see you all later. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a good one.